food. Not that it began in the rear dorte. No, of course it didn't. It began in the dortoir, which probably explains Waldherr and Aylmund's absence. I mean, we must have left them in the dortoir. Doubtless I didn't want to share. Doubtless this too reflects an essential poverty of spirit. Still, if that is true, if they were there, convenient, handy, why choose me? Given Waldherr's natural gifts, the obduracy that made Aylmund as trustworthy a receptacle for secrets as a wooden box, why did Offor turn to me? Why burden me with this memory? I do not know. It makes no sense. Yet that is what happened. Even now I can see him standing there, back to the wall, hands behind him as if hiding something. I think I must have given him a look or signed something derisive because I remember his forehead crumpling. And that does make sense. Does fit with my memory of the boy. Offor's forehead having been, in its way, as supple an organ of expression as most people's eyes or mouth. And on this occasion it crumpled uncertainly. He looked at me. Forehead crumpled. Offor looked at me, raised a hand, walked 2 fingers quickly through the air. I shook my head. No. Duda had already explained that. The dead animals were a sign, he told us, an omen. They'd said so in chapter. All the little corpses meant death was coming. The death was coming and it rode on the air like a horse. The part about the horse hadn't made sense to me, but Duda said he was just repeating what the furnace master had said. Duda said the furnace master told them there were different kinds of airs, just as there are different kinds of horses, and that bad airs, like the one Death rode, were heavier than good airs. He said this was why Offor had found so many dead squirrels and mice, and why all the village dogs were dying. He said that being smaller than people, living closer to the ground, these animals were more susceptible to heavy, low-lying airs. But now that death had killed all the little animals, it was going to rise. According to Duda, the whole valley was filling up with death, like a bowl filling up with water. He said the bad air was at our knees now, but soon would rise to our necks, and then our heads. Waldherr had made a joke about this. He'd said that Offor would die first, and then me, and then Aylmund. He said he would last the longest because he was the tallest. He laughed when he said it, but you could tell he didn't really think it was funny, which was why I didn't want to go to the rear door. No, I shook my head, no. Offor closed his eyes, opened them again. He turned his head, looked down the length of the wall at his back. I looked down that way, but there was nothing to see, just beds, a few windows, the gray and rainy light. Offor looked back at me, his expression different now, changed, a decision of some sort apparently made. He brought his hands from behind his back. He was holding a piece of bread. I glanced over at the door, made sure it was closed, then stood up, walked to the nearest window. The garth was reassuringly empty. I looked back at Offor, smiled. He entered the rear door ahead of me. We'd been using the necessarium ever since Lothbear caught us digging graves behind the lavabo. I had no idea why Offor took such pleasure in searching out and finding the dead animals, but whatever the reason, the resulting funerals had provided something of a diversion, or at least they had until now. Now that we knew what each of these deaths signified, how much closer they brought us to Duda's full bowl of water, I was, I think for understandable reasons, less interested in make-believe. A few brief words, maybe a priestly gesture or two, and then I was going to tip whatever bundle of fur and bones Offor had found this time down the nearest hole, and then eat that bread. Offor took up a position by the window, arms firmly at his sides, neither bread nor beast in evidence. Something about his posture made me think he was planning on being the priest, but food or no food, I wasn't going to let that happen. Heretofore Waldherr had filled that role. This time it was my turn. Offor raised an arm. Before I could stop him or object, Offor raised an arm, and his sleeve slipping down toward his shoulder, the little room filled suddenly with a bad smell. What's that? The skin on Offor's forehead drew taut like the skin of a drum. He pointed at the inside of his elbow. I took a hesitant step closer. The smell was really quite offensive, and was able to see a small dark spot where Offor pointed. The thing looked too black to be part of his skin. Did you burn yourself? Offor shook his head. I came closer still, breathing through my mouth. Did something bite you? I don't think so. We'll cover it up and we'll show Father Prior. Offor pulled his sleeve down, and I turned to go, the bread crowding once more into my thoughts, making me a little angry with Offor, this smell, the fact that now, hungry as I was going to have to go without. Help him with this. Wait. I turned around, ready to say something. The skin on Offor's forehead drew taut once more, then abruptly curdled. Looking at me, never taking his eyes off me, he reached down and jerked up his woolens. I turned away in disgust. A small hand grasped my sleeve. More disgust, and with it now the first touch of horror. I jerked away. Was there something wrong with Offor? Did he think he needed me to stand guard while he made water? I jerked away, spun around, the look on my face daring him to try that again. Offor appeared as shocked as I, eyebrows raised in a show of almost comic fright. I stared at him. Offor glanced down, and despite myself, despite the fact I knew I didn't want to, that I would do almost anything to avoid looking down there, I followed his gaze. Along the crease created where Offor's left leg joined his body, a small line of welts stood out like the sting of a whip, rebuke to my curiosity. A rash? I asked, my voice sounding suddenly different, wrong, a voice belonging to someone else. I don't know. They weren't there yesterday. I shrugged, anxious now to leave, to get out of there. The room suddenly too small, its roof too close. The once pleasant sound of rain on thatch now becomes something else entirely, a mad, irreligious chant. Offor looked back down at his groin, woolens held up around his chin like a bib. I don't know, Winweed, he said, shaking his head like an old man shaking his head over an apple gone bad, but I think I'm going to die. And on that pleasant note, thank you. Well, I didn't see anybody nod off, so that's probably a good sign. Do you have any questions for me before we return to the table over there? Yes?
Why did you select the 7th century?
You know, that's the question everybody asks. And my flip answer is because it's everybody's favorite. In reality, there were a number of different interests that eventually drew me to that time period. I got interested in early Christian practice of contemplative prayer, an early form of Christian meditation. The more I learned about that, I wanted to learn about its origins. I discovered, then you find yourself studying monasticism, and then I discovered the Venerable Bede, who was arguably the first true historian of England and wrote an incredible history. I found all this information, and a story began to come to life in my mind. So, and he wrote about the 7th century. He lived in the 7th century. Yes?
Are you going to do an audio book? Because you read beautifully. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, my publisher's standing in the back of the room. Perhaps we should ask him. Actually, he has said he's interested in doing an audiobook, so hopefully, yeah, I would love to, and I would love to read it. It's fun reading. Anything else? Yes.
What's your next book?
Well, I actually, my publisher, Ron Souter of Seekin Publishing, deserves a lot of credit for this book. He's a remarkable man. I think he's done a beautiful job producing it. And he's been an absolute angel to me. You know, you hear all these stories that writers tell about how rough the publishing world is and how cruel and unthinking and unsympathetic publishers are. Well, boy, that's not true. This guy's an angel. He's just a wonderful human being. You hear all this, Ron? He really is. And among the kind things he's done is he's telling me he wants to do another book with me at some point. So it's got me thinking, and I've got a couple of ideas. And another 10 years. I don't know where I'd find the time. You know, this library it keeps me pretty busy, so I'm not sure. Michael?
Was communication such that the proximity to the birth of Muhammad enter into this?
You know, good question. There is oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, he asked if the because of the time period, if Mohammedanism begins to be felt, if the communication was such that in England they would have even been aware of what was going on down in the Middle East and North Africa later. And I am not certain, but I think they would have. There was pretty good communication, and as a result, there is a single line in the novel that refers to Saracens. and what they're doing in the South. So yes, communication, the Dark Ages, it's a great, poetic sounding name, but they probably weren't really as dark as we think. And certainly everybody lived big, complicated lives just the way we do. They were unaware of the fact that they were living in the Dark Ages. They thought it was pretty modern, what they were doing. And there was there was a fair amount of communication in terms of commerce, back and forth. And the monasteries in particular, because monks traveled a lot, it was every monk's wish and desire to someday go to see Rome. And a lot of them did, certainly a lot of the abbots, and they traveled to big chapters for their at their mother houses on the continent. So there was a fair amount of communication, I believe. Yes, ma'am.
It was good to hear you read it, to hear the names.
Oh.
As your publishers here, I would have liked to have had a pronunciation guide the way.
Well, to give my publisher credit, he suggested it as well, and we thought about it. First of all, I wanted to limit the amount of back matter, but I also, my own personal feeling on pronunciation from a time period this far away, it's really hard to know how anything was pronounced. All those people are dead. I know it's going to come as a shock to some of you, but and we can surmise, and don't get me wrong, there are experts and historians and philologists who spent their careers trying to figure out exactly how words were pronounced in Old English. And there are ways that you can do it. You can scan poetry from the time period, Beowulf, what have you, and it gives you some idea of how these words must have been pronounced. And of course, we know it's a Germanic tongue, so a lot of the rules would have been the same. But nobody made any tape recordings. It's hard to know for sure. And so I think probably whatever pronunciation works best and fits the rhythm of the sentence for you is probably a good one to go with. I pronounce the main character's name Windweed, for what it's worth. Timothy.
How often did you get to travel to the area?
I only got to go to England once during the course of researching this, and I wouldn't have been able to do that if my parents hadn't paid for it. Good old mom and dad. But I was awfully glad I did, and I saw, fortunately I'm married to a professional historian. Melissa's somewhere in the room, unless she's run off, back in the back. She's a PhD historian, brilliant, bad taste in men, but aside from that, she's a really good lady. And she taught me a great deal about how to do research, and found a lot of good archives, sites I should visit when I went over there. So she really deserves a lot of credit for this. And then also my own research, I discovered there was an historian at that time at Durham University named Gerald Bonner, who was the expert in the field, and he very generously gave himself to this project and spent some time with me and talked with me and guided me towards certain source materials that really helped. Yes, ma'am.
When and where do you write? Do you have a routine?
Oh, I sure do. I have to write every day, and I write in the morning. And unfortunately, I really envy these people. John Steinbeck supposedly wrote The Grapes of Wrath in something like 6 months. And I mean, that's a work of true genius. But to do that, I would imagine he worked at least an 8-hour day. I can write for about 2 hours in the morning, and then after that, I can continue to write, but it's just not any good anymore. And I tend, as a matter of fact, to ruin what I've written in the first 2 hours if I keep going after 2. So after that, I just drink. No, after that, I come to the library and go to work. I have a real job. Yes, ma'am. Oh, hi, Cindy. Yes.
Now that this book is finished, do you still think about these characters and feel them in any way as people still in your life?
I sure do. For one thing, Melissa and I, though we wanted to, never got to have any children. And so I sometimes tell people, and it began to feel this way to me over the years as I worked on the book, that Windweed kind of is as close to having a child as I ever got to. And so in a sense, he's sort of my boy. And I'm real proud of him. He's a good kid, I think. He makes mistakes, we all do, but he's a good kid.
And you gave him away.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Wow. Good for you. Gee. Howard?
The hermit in the book.
Father Gwyneth.
Did you ever have a mentor like him?
Sure, I've had many. You've taught me a lot about baseball. And in no small part, he's based upon my father, who was an incredible influence in my life and a great man. I was very fortunate to have him. So a lot of Gwyneth comes from my dad. But I've also known some really good priests, to be quite honest. Father Gwyneth is a priest as well. And in particular, I sometimes think about, there was a Father Jack O'Hara in Northern Virginia who had an effect upon this book as well, a good man. Anybody else? Yes?
What language were the monks actually speaking back in that time? And you made a reference to the abbot knowing a foreign language as well. Was that Celtic or something?
Well, there would have been several languages floating about. But most of the monks in this book would have been Anglo-Saxons, and so they would have been speaking Old English. But within the monastery, certainly all the priests would have also known Latin. And yeah, I assume you're talking about, there is a point in the book where two of the priests speak back and forth to each other in what they call, what the child refers to as the Roman tongue, that's Latin. And he doesn't understand it. But they were a pretty bright bunch. And then there would have been Gaelic as well on the Welsh side of the mountains. The Cumbraji, they're called Cumbraji in this novel because that's what they call themselves. Welsh is a Germanic word meaning foreigner. But as I mentioned earlier, the Venerable Bede, who is just a terrific influence on this book and a brilliant man, he was an oblate himself. As a small boy, he was given to the monastery of Jarrow, and it's believed that he never left there. And so he lived his entire life within an area of maybe about 20 or 30 acres, and yet he became fluent in Latin and Greek and Old English. He may very well have known Gaelic. He wrote many books. He wrote the first tide chart ever compiled for the British Isles, and it was so accurate that the British Navy was still using it in the 16th century. So you got to be careful about thinking Dark Ages. These are this is a primitive time. In some way, I don't speak Greek, but he did. Yes, Susan.
My point out, Bill, that at that time and for many, many years or many centuries thereafter, if you were very bright and you might say scholastic, the church was one of the only options.
Oh, sure.
That's why so many ended up in monasteries, nowhere else to go.
Yeah, and it was in some ways, there was safety in that too. I mean, there was some protection in the sense you're probably not going to starve to death. There were a lot of advantages. Susan?
Yes, and thinking about a second book, would it also be set in this time frame or in a historical?
It definitely would not be in this time frame. Just because I've kind of done this. I'd like to do something else. I have thought about different time periods. I've also thought about melding something that both is taking place in the current day and refers back to an earlier time period. I've got a couple of ideas in mind, but I'm not sure what I'm going to do with them. Yeah, Julia.
Hi, Bill. Do you believe in reincarnation?
Man, they told me there wasn't going to be any math on this test.
Do you feel at all as if you might be channeling a prior life?
Well, I don't know. I've never, I would love it if there's such a thing as reincarnation. I think it'd be great. But I haven't. I don't know. It's not part of my belief system. For what it's worth, I'm a Roman Catholic. But there are many times that I have trouble believing in any kind of afterlife. I want to believe, that's what faith is all about. But a lot of the evidence seems to point in a different direction, and it scares the daylights out of me. There's a great line in Wendell Berry, a character named Burley Coulter is talking about whether or not there's a heaven, and he says, "I sure hope there is. It'd pay off a lot of mortgages." And it would, wouldn't it? Anybody else? Yeah, Jim.
It seemed like a more innocent time. I mean, the plague was horrible, of course, but the kind of abuses that Erasmus of Rotterdam speaks about, where he said a boy was beaten to death daily in the monasteries, or there was more innocence to be found in a brothel than, geez, you know, this is during the Reformation period. This is a guy who believed in staying with the church instead of leaving, like Martin Luther. And yet that's what he experienced when he was flung into a monastery at an early age, because his parents had that died of the plague.
Yeah, and you know I don't know that much about the Reformation period. I mean, you know, it's closer in time to us than this time than it is to this time period. So it's a great distance away. Having said that, if there's anything that I've learned from studying the history of monasticism and the church, it's that, you know, like all institutions, they go through good times and bad times, and there are times when they really are in need of reform, and then there are times when they really try to get back to their roots and try to be good guys. And I think this was one of those time periods when, yeah, it was in a way more innocent. Certainly, there isn't a lot of evidence for the kind of abuses that some monasteries were famous for during the Reformation. Am I getting a hand signal?
No,
Okay.
no.
Yes, Jack. Yeah.
I heard that they used to, in some of the monasteries, they didn't speak, they had to chant. Is that what-
They do. The chant was a very important part of most monasteries.
I'll tell you a story about this. The head abbot, he would always say, "Good morning," and all the oblates would say, "Good morning," except this one rebel in the back of the room. He said evening instead of morning. And the abbot heard him, and he said, "Someone chanted evening."
Wow, so that's where that comes from. I've always wondered. That's terrific. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
The book is The Oblate's